Joining me right now is Brendan Buck, MSNBC political analyst and former press secretary to one-time VP nominee Paul Ryan, and Amisha Cross, Democratic strategist and former advisor to the Obama campaign. Welcome to you both. So, Amisha, you start here. Did President Biden's remarks after the debate do anything to blunt people's fears, or is at least a certain level of damage done?
I think that we have to be honest with ourselves. There has been a certain level of damage done. The stakes were really high in that first presidential debate. And people remember that Biden not only called for that debate, but also set the parameters for it. They also remember the conversations around who all was in the debate prep room, all the hours spent in that debate. And I think that, in many cases that fell flat. And, the party as well as the candidate and his team has to own up to that fact. And debates draw a larger audience than rallies do. There have been, global concern around what happened at that debate. But I do think that Joe Biden coming out, not hiding from this, leaning in on it, telling people where he stands, and doing as much as he can on the ground, specifically in the battleground states, is going to be what matters here. The debate, no doubt, was disastrous, but it's not something I believe that he cannot come back from.
So, Brendan, if Biden keeps up a robust appearance on the campaign trail, how much is that going to help reduce Democrats' post-debate anxiety? I mean, has there been a plausible explanation for what happened Thursday night?
Look, if they take heart in what happened in North Carolina at that rally, I think that is exactly how we got into this problem in the first place. That was a person reading from a teleprompter in front of a cheering, adoring crowd. Any politician should be able to do that. And they seem to have convinced themselves through events like that and very carefully choreographing everything he has done for the last few years that, oh, well, he can get by. And they have, frankly, gaslit a lot of us that he's not as old as, or he's not in as much cognitive decline as we're seeing. And that all came crumbling down. Frankly, I think they've been lying to us. I think they knew that he is not as sharp as they were letting on. I think they knew when he declined to do a Super Bowl interview in front of millions of people. I think they knew that he was like this when he turns down all kinds of media, when they refused to give the audio of the interview with Robert Hur, the special counsel. I think they knew that he was like this, and they allowed him to run, or he chose to run still. And here we've seen very clearly what is actually going on here, and I think it's pretty devastating and difficult to come back from.
But look, can you see why they're holding on to hope, Brendan? Because they believe that Joe Biden is the only one who can beat Donald Trump.
I think they believe that. I think a big part of this is an incredible amount of disrespect for Kamala Harris. It's very clear that they looked around and said, nobody else can do this. I don't know that that's true. And I may have understood where they were coming from if it was simply a matter of looking at the polls. But again, it's not just looking at the polls. You have to look at your own candidate, the person who you are seeing behind closed doors every single day. They told us he is sharp as a tack behind closed doors. Just trust us, and trying to get us not to see what we have been seeing over and over again. And so, yeah, if you look at polling, that's fine. But they had to have known things like this were going to happen. And could theoretically someone dig out of this hole? Sure. But I think what he showed us is he is not capable cognitively of doing that. He does not have the stamina to do those things that are necessary to dig out of it.
So, Amisha, I want you to weigh in on this. What are your thoughts on this? Because Kamala Harris, for her part, she came out really forcefully after the debate.
Absolutely. And I think that Vice President Kamala Harris, she knows that she sits at the right hand of power. She's someone who probably has the closest relationship to the president when it comes to not only his legacy and this presidency, but also she is the second flag on this ticket. So it makes a lot of sense. But I would argue that this is also a president who just came off of, for lack of a better term, a European tour. This is a president who also just came out of conversations around the G6. This is a president who has had several international conversations and exemplified strong leadership there. I think that his campaign needs a revamp. I don't think there's any lie, to be found there. The campaign needs a revamp, a restructure. He cannot keep doing things as is. But we also have to acknowledge that Kamala Harris stands by the president. She is not trying to eke him over. She is not trying to leapfrog him. She understands the importance of the legacy of this president and what it means for him to see everything through and finish the job.
And you know who else is standing by this president is former President Barack Obama. Remember, that was the guy who said to Joe Biden beforehand, you don't have to do this. But he believes in him. And he said he understands having a bad night. He had a really bad debate as well. I mean, the headlines were just deplorable for him the day after. But he went on to win. Ronald Reagan had the same experience, by the way. He went on to win. So, Amisha, when you have Barack Obama standing in your corner and saying, come on, guys, let's just let this play out, what does that say to you?
It says that former President Obama knows how this works. Anybody can have a bad debate night. With that being said, having served on Obama's campaign team, I know after that bad debate night, several of the people who were in the room with prep and everything else did not have a job 2 weeks later. We have to make sure that we're also, again, realigning, understanding what the opponent's strategy is, but also understanding the facts on the ground. What we are seeing is that diverse voters, younger voters, and others, beyond the debate, there have been some very serious concerns that they have. And President Biden and the campaign has to meet them where they are. There is a serious campaign restructure that has to go on here. And I do think that this will last beyond the debate. Be ye advised, the debate was in June. The election is in November. Most people aren't going to be talking about this debate during early voting, and they're darn sure not going to be talking about it in November. What's going to matter is what's happening on the ground. And his ground game has to be strong, and he has to have the right people in place to get it done.
100% true, but let's admit, you had 50 million people or so look at that debate and watch it play out, and there's going to be countless millions more looking at clips and the like, and it'll be certainly the narrative for some time about the poor debate performance.
And there will be millions more who are also watching in the next couple of weeks when the sentencing comes down for former President Trump.
Yeah, no, you're right. Let me get to something that you wrote, Brendan. It's a piece that titled, Donald Trump may not have won the presidential debate, but Biden lost. And you say it's all the more troubling because of how bad his opponent was at the same time. So my question to you, did any of the double haters come away thinking Biden wasn't good, but Trump was worse? I mean, did Donald Trump lose anyone?
I guess we'll see in polling. But I guess where I come down is what Donald Trump did that night was what we all sort of expect out of Donald Trump. It's the same exact Donald Trump that we have seen since he started running in 2015.
Okay, but hang on. Is that fair? Because this is a guy who we've become used to this. He has normalized this kind of bad behavior and the way he talks and lies and spewing out things that he thinks if he says it, people will think it's true when it's blatantly not. So, I mean, is it fair to compare these two on that level in terms of substance?
I think the person whose job it was to prosecute that case was Joe Biden on that debate stage. And the fact that he couldn't do that, he couldn't point out all of these things, is all the more evidence that he is not fit to have this. Look,
wait, how would you, Brendan, how would you go about preparing someone for a debate when the point of a debate is to get all of your points across, right? You're trying to say, here's what I've accomplished, here's that. And you're going up against somebody who's constantly lying throughout the entire debate or going off topic or refusing to answer a question. How would you even begin to prepare someone to do two things like that at the very same time?
Well, I'll say one thing. People understand when he's lying. When he says crazy stuff, people understand it. We act like people at home have no agency or ability to understand whether or not that is a ridiculous thing that he said. People understand it. What Joe Biden should have been able to do is prosecute a case against Donald Trump on issues like abortion on January 6th. And every time he had an opportunity to do that, he fell flat on his face. And if Joe Biden is the only person capable of beating Donald Trump, then that is a bad statement for the Democratic Party. If there's nobody else in the Democratic Party who could do a better job than he did prosecuting the case on those issues, on any issue, there was not a single issue where Donald Trump has incredible vulnerabilities where he laid a hand on him. He just couldn't do it. He's incapable of doing it.
Is all the talk, Amisha, about Biden's poor performance, is that overshadowing the most inflammatory things that Donald Trump said? I mean, look, he lied, accusing Democrats of supporting murdering babies after birth. He attacked our justice system. And then there was this comment. We're going to play it because it has sparked a lot of backlash. Here it is.
The millions of people that he's allowed to come in through the border. They're taking black jobs now, and it could be 18, it could be 19, and even 20 million people. They're taking black jobs, and they're taking Hispanic jobs.
So to my point earlier, in a succinct way, does Trump get a pass because he has normalized his very much not normal behavior?
Trump has been getting a pass since 2016. I think that one of the things that happens is that he has been bombastic. He has been someone who lies and lies regularly. It happens as quickly as he opens his mouth. And yes, some of the onus was on Joe Biden to prosecute the case. But the other thing is there was no live fact checking happening in real time. There was no attempts by the moderators to actually get Donald Trump to answer a single question that they asked. On top of that, he actually pushed towards blaming Mayor Bowser of D.C. for January 6th. The man made up so much as he went along, but because he did it forcefully, he did it with strength, and he did it with a level of sensibility to a certain extent where he wasn't, wiling out. It came across as a very strong and poignant message, even though it was lies the whole time. He knew how to deliver the message. And I think that on style alone, he wins in that sense. But it's not that he wasn't lying. He lies all the dang time. And the media should be writing stories about this. The New York Times told Joe Biden essentially that he doesn't need to run, but they're not saying it to the guy who has been twice impeached. They're not saying it to the guy who's been found liable for rape. They're not saying it to the guy who's got 34 plus felony charges. They're not saying it to the guy who is unfit for office and who's willing to turn America into a dictatorship. At what point does the media do its job in prosecuting Donald Trump? Because they, quite frankly, just cannot get above themselves and just keep letting this man slide.
Let me just add, though, that the New York Times editorial, it did say that Donald Trump's performance was disqualifying. So there is that. Last question to you, Brendan. Is there a debate in September? Should there be a debate in September?
There should be. I don't know that Donald Trump has any real incentive to do it. And I would say I think there's a lot of risk in Joe Biden having another debate. If he were to have any performance that is other than good, and if he had any more stumbles, I think that would be really problematic. I assume they're going to want another chance. I would probably put it at a 50-50 proposition right now.
Okay. Brendan Buck, Amisha Cross, this was spirited. I thank you guys for rolling with it with me. Thanks. Later on.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.